Welcome. This is a little video we're going to do here about how to get around in sun, wind, and light, how to navigate, where to find things that you're looking for. The first thing to know is that there's two volumes. There's a printed volume, which is a square format. What you see here on the screen right now is 2 pages, a full spread out of that printed volume. There's also an electronic volume. The electronic volume, you can recognize it's in landscape format. All right, so here's the title page. I'm just going to go straight down to the contents overview. Now you can get Sun, Wind, and Light in a printed volume. You can also get fully electronic versions of this, which are downloadable web-based systems with digital rights management. There's two versions of that I know about. One is called Vital Source, and the other is called Red Shelf. And they both allow you to see the content of both of these volumes in an electronic on-screen version. Some people like one, some people like the other. So anyway, the first place here, this will tell you approximately what's in each of the volumes. So on the left-hand side here, we have what's in the printed volume. That starts off with navigation. How do you find your way around? Has the contents and so forth. Different ways. There's multiple ways to get around in Sun, Wind, and Light. It's not really a linear book. It's more of a knowledge base in some ways. And so you don't always read it cover to cover. You don't always read it, well, one page after the other even. So a bit like looking for something on a website, you're going to go to find the areas that you need for the project that you're working on. Part two is using sun, wind, and light. It talks a little bit about buildings and energy use. And then something really nice I'll show you called the design decision chart for net zero. Part three has synergies. Those are sort of 2-page spreads that give you some essential themes that almost every building has to work with if it's going to end up to be a net zero or a net positive energy project. There's a new idea in here in the third edition that we call bundles. Bundles have to do with families of strategies that work together. You'll find the bundles in the printed volume. We also have two sections that are condensed versions of the longer strategies. One, we broke out the favorite design tools. These are things that Charlie and I used most often. And once you know a particular strategy, then and you want to have the printed volume, then you can go and get a short version of it. It might have just the tool that you need there. There's also favorite design strategies. So if you don't want to read the whole book, the whole 400 pages in the electronic volume and look at all the strategies, you can get a high-level overview of some of our favorite strategies in part 6. Part 7 is high performance buildings. That's very much tied to the sun, wind, and light spreadsheets, or we call it sun, wind, and light tools. That's available on the companion website. And it takes you through a kind of simple version of calculations for how to get to net zero. Even if you don't use the spreadsheet, you can get an overview and you can see how that works. If you were thinking about doing a small building and doing those calculations by hand, it also is helpful for the principles overall. Then we also have all the appendices and the indices in the printed volume. You can find anything out of both volumes by looking at the printed volume. Now, what's over here in the electronic volume is the detailed design strategies. If you're familiar with the second edition, they're the same kind of landscape format. That's typically about 2 to 4 pages per design strategy. There's 106 of those. Then we have the detailed analysis techniques. That's moved here. It started off in the beginning in the second edition. We moved it sort of to the end. Those analysis techniques are things like estimating loads and selecting design strategies, understanding your climate, and so forth. Then we have the appendices. All the appendices go into the electronic volume, so we didn't have to print all those sun charts, sundials, climate data, climate maps, etc. Then there's also a companion website. I'll show you that a little bit later. And that has some additional resources. It has lots of climate data on there for representative cities for every climate zone in the United States and Alaska and some in Canada. Some climate analysis reports just for the US. That just takes that data and sort of runs through a basic analysis of understanding the opportunities and constraints in that particular climate. The SWL tools spreadsheet is available on the companion site for free. And that's also where you go to download the electronic volume once you have the printed volume. And there's also a bibliography of everything, all the citations in the book. So we're still in the printed volume here. That's the overview. Then we can go to the printed contents and you could look at that in greater detail. Notice that if something is designated with an S, S1, 2, 3, that's a synergy. If something is designated with a B, B1 through 9, right, that's a bundle. And then if something has no designation on the front of it, like this 14, daylight spacing angles, that's referring to a design strategy. That will also show up as strategy number 14 in the electronic volume. Notice that if we're referring to one volume or the other, it's SWL printed or SWL electronic with a little lightning bolt symbol there, just to remind you it's electronic. So we can find things in a more detailed way this way, and the electronic contents in their abbreviated form like this are also found in the printed and in the electronic, so no matter where you're going, you can still find it. Notice that page numbers referenced in the electronic volume have an E in front. E.19 means page 19 in the electronic volume. If a page number has no E in front of it, that means it should be in the printed volume. Here we have all the strategies listed. Notice these are listed in terms of scale. So we use a 9 level of complexity scalar system in Sun, Wind, and Light. In the electronic volume, we'll start with the largest scale and work down to the smallest scale. So let me go back up one page here. You can see, so level 9 is actually neighborhoods, and you'll see level 9 are bundles. So you can go over to the printed volume, it'll say CSWL printed, so you can know that's where you're going to find the bundles. You can see there's level 8, urban fabric, and that's the level or scale that we start off with in the electronic volume to distribute these strategies. There's level 7, urban elements. Then we come down to the building scale, level 6. Building scale level 6 are bundles again. That'll be found in the printed volume. Level 5, room organizations. Level 4, the room. Level 3, building systems. And level 2, elements. Then down all the way to level 1, materials. So you might notice there's 3 categories of scales also. There's the scale of the building parts. That's levels 1 through 3. There's the scale of the buildings. That's 4, 5, and 6. And then there's the scale, back up again, of the building groups. That would be level 7, 8, and 9. So that follows the same kind of organization that we found in the second edition. Within each one of those, we're looking then at categories that have to do with the elements that are configured or selected or that are being designed at each one of those scales. So at the level of the room, we're looking at things like rooms and courtyards. We might also be looking at circulation. At the level of elements, we're looking at walls, roofs, floors, and so on. So if a particular strategy helps you to make decisions about a combination of those elements, it'll say walls, roofs, and floors, for instance, or maybe just walls and windows down here for low contrast. And then over here in the detailed analysis techniques, we have all kinds of things like sundials, wind roses, ways to understand and analyze a microclimate, ways to look at occupancy and electric lighting and so forth and figure out what the heat gains and losses of a building are, and so forth. All right, one of my favorite ways to find your way around is the alphabetic content. So once you get familiar a little bit with the design strategies, the names of things in sun, wind, and light, you might say, well, I want to find daylight zones. Where is daylight zones? So if I go to the alphabetic contents, I can come down and find that daylight zones is right here. You can find out on page E114. So we've taken everything in the printed volume, everything in the electronic volume, including analysis techniques, bundles, synergies, and design strategies, and you'll find them all here. One more thing you'll find is something with the designations of P. Those are high performance sections that are found in the printed volume. So for instance, P6 carbon neutral buildings, it's kind of self-explanatory what that topic might be about. So alphabetic contents, really fun and easy way to find your way around. And here's a key for all these things I've just been talking about. Part one is all about navigation. What you can find here is different ways to find what you're looking for in sun, wind, and light, or different ways to relate one strategy to another. So for instance, we have the navigation matrix by scale and energy topic. We can navigate by design strategy maps. We can find what strategies work in particular climates, and so on. So let's just show you, and I'll show you that, but just to note here, the various kinds of appendices. You can find a detailed contents. We've been looking at abbreviated contents. Detailed contents also include the headers for each strategy, the strategy statement that defines what that strategy is about. So you can find both the detailed and the electronic contents in their detailed versions. There's a subject index, a designer and precedent index, and a design tools index. We'll take a look at those in just a minute. But right now, while we're here in the navigation section. So here's a section, we call it the navigation matrix by scale and energy topic. Each one of these ways of navigating has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, so we try to describe that on the front end. Here's that matrix, and you can see there's different rows. Different rows are analysis and evaluation techniques. Then we have the strategies, building groups, buildings, and building parts. And you can see each one of those scales has 3 different levels of complexity. And then across the top, we have different topics. So does that strategy deal only with heating, only with cooling, or with some combination like cooling and ventilation, heating and cooling, and so on? Down at the end, we have some that only apply to daylighting and some that only apply to power. And then if we zoom in, you can see that each one of these has a label there, and it'll say, for instance, if it's an analysis technique, it might say A9 daylight availability, A10 daylight obstructions, etc. Or it might be a bundle, such as B1 neighborhood of light, or it might be a design strategy, such as thin plan number 35, or daylight zones number 41. So you can begin to figure out, what am I working on today? Am I working on one of these topical issues, or am I working at a particular scale today in my design? And you can find your strategies that way. This is one that we particularly like, navigation by design strategy maps. And it works with this 9-level system of scale and complexity. We talked about that before. It goes from materials at the bottom up to neighborhoods at the top. The idea is that a strategy at a larger scale helps to organize the strategies at lower scales. So the lines represent relationships among the different strategies. A strategy at a lower level of complexity helps to build the pattern or strategy that you find at the next level up. And so it's a nice way of saying, if I'm using one strategy, what else might be related to that? What else might I want to include? And make sure I'm not leaving something out at a particular scale. So the design strategy maps go through all of the design strategies and the bundles and link those together. The bundles you can see are designated by having a heavy dashed line around them. The one with the heavy solid lines are the core strategies. Those core strategies show up in the bundles, and we'll show you how that works later. But a core strategy essentially means that it applies to both variations of some particular bundle. So each of these icons represents a design strategy. You can see that each one is labeled at the bottom with both its name, in some cases slightly abbreviated, but in most cases it's the full name, and the strategy number. So we can move down to whole buildings, room organizations, and rooms. So here's an example of where room organizations, you could think about those as plans and sections. Multiple room organization patterns come together to make something a pattern at the whole building scale. Uh, in that case, we're up to level 6, we bump up to the bundles. If we go down from level 5 to the room scale, different, there's more rooms than room organizations. There's more rooms than floor plans, for instance, is one way to think about it. And each one of those at the room scale combines with one or more other strategies to help form a larger strategy at the room organization level. And then we're on down to level 3, building systems, level 2 elements, and level 1 materials. And notice that some of these have numbers and little black circles, and those link to, that indicates that there's a link there that goes to a strategy number at a higher level. And it's just a practical thing in terms of working in a book in a printed format. Not all the lines can be connected to everything that they needed to be connected to. So for instance, 96 here, this is bridging across, and it's telling us that 72 mechanical heat distribution is connected to 96 mechanical space ventilation, right? And because it's going across the spine, that would be hard to follow. Other ones are hard to follow because they just go from page to page or it's too far away. Another way you can navigate around and find the strategies in sun, wind, and light is to think about what climate your building is located in. So this section is called Navigation by Climate. This first little table here gives you some indication that there's one way of perceiving the climate. For instance, let's say you have a cold climate. You might experience that as a cold place that's heating dominated. And a skin-loaded building like a residence or a thin plan building might actually follow the climate much in the same way that you would expect it to. The outdoor room, however, was going to be more extreme, more affected by the climate than the indoor space, of course. And so we designate that as a C2. C2 meaning something very cold or heating, heavily heating dominated. Then if it's an internal load dominated building with high internal gains or thick building footprint, for instance, where lights are on all the time and it's hard to lose heat and be connected with the outdoor environment except around the perimeter, then we might have cold in the winter time. We could think about that as a cold climate, but then we could also think about the summer as being a hot, humid, or a hot, arid climate because of that shift in the balance point and the need to have more cooling and less heating as the internal gains go up. So we start off with the basic climate, and then we can modify that one way or the other. You can also find your climate zones. So you have the IECC climate zones for the continental US and for Alaska, for Canada. Actually, those zones tend to stop around, initially around 7, and then now we have a zone 8. But as you see in Alaska and Canada, the conditions can be quite extreme as you get up towards the pole. So I've just added a zone 9 in there for comparison to be the same kind of increment as the other zones. Also, recently we've added a zone 0, so you can see that at the tip of Florida, Miami is in zone 1, but Miami is certainly not the hottest place on the planet. It's not even technically in the tropics. So a zone 0 is even warmer. Then of course we have dry on one side, moist on the other side of the continent, and then that kind of unique marine condition, mostly on the west coast. These are the basic definitions of the climates. You can read about that, but here's the interesting part. So we can take each one of those climates, zones 1, 2, 3, etc., and we have an A and we have a B. And then we can look at, just in a general sense, the ratio or proportion between heating and cooling in that climate. Now that would apply to the kinds of basic conditions that you see listed across the bottom. So I like to use that as a way to get a sense of, well, do I put more attention into heating? Do I put more attention into cooling? Is it a balance? If I bias towards heating condition, what do I do in the cooling condition to moderate that? So what we have here is a listing of strategies by climate type and by the energy intentions that you're interested in. So a lot of these strategies actually apply to all the climates. Some of the strategies are written in such a way that they have both heating and cooling, or they have a range of different climates built into the strategy itself. Daylighting, most of daylighting applies to most climates, of course. On the right here you have just things that apply to cold climates, and you can see the little bioclimatic diagram that indicates we're in the heating territory. And then if you want to focus on something that has to do with sun, or something that has to do with wind or temperature, you can find subcategories of strategies and analysis techniques and so forth listed underneath there. And also ones that deal with multiple forces. So we have also strategies that work in all hot climates. And then we have some that are really primarily oriented towards hot, arid climates, and some that are primarily oriented towards hot, humid climates. So that's another way to find out which kinds of strategies or bundles or analysis techniques you might be interested in. There's a section called Using Sun, Wind, and Light. This is kind of worth reading up on the front end. The main thing I want to show you here is the design decision chart, and this references schematically 7 different kinds of questions that you might think about. Each of those sets of questions is linked to one of the synergies. Each of those synergies is then linked to bundles and strategies that can be used to carry it out. And here's generally what that looks like. So we start with a question on the left-hand side. We're looking at resources. We might ask a question, are the site resources sufficient to meet the heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation, and power needs? Charlie's answer to all of these is yes, if you want to do a net zero building. So you can see the large icon relates to a synergy. Those synergies are found in the printed volume. There's 7 of them. They're just little 2-page spreads that deal with recurrent kinds of themes when you're thinking about climate and energy in buildings. Over on the right-hand side, you see analysis techniques and or design strategies, same kinds of icons that we saw in the design strategy maps. So if I'm interested in trying to answer that question number 1, there are some of the things that you might take a look at. And every analysis technique or every design strategy shows up one place and one place only. Now in this one, for instance, there's 2 sub-questions in question number 3 about both neighborhood access and site microclimate. There's one synergy that works with that called resource-rich environments. And then there are 4 bundles up at the top you can see. These are neighborhood of light. That's a neighborhood scale bundle, as is cooling neighborhood, solar neighborhood, and integrated urban pattern, which deals with all 3 of those, heating, cooling, and lighting. And then a 4th one, outdoor microclimates. Then you see the smaller icons for each design strategy. Those are strategies that will be associated with each of those bundles. So it gives you a kind of conceptual linkage for how different kinds of themes dealing with different content and scales are linked together and related in Sun, Wind, and Light. And this moves you through a series of questions, which basically goes from trying to understand the problem, moving through the site, building, and then down into the element scales, and eventually into apertures, thermal storage envelope, and then down into systems and controls and green power. Here's just one example of a synergy. So synergy, as we said, is just a 2-page spread. It's just dealing with a theme, a recurrent theme that architects have to deal with. This one we call spatial zoning. And it says integrating climate and use variables yields opportunities for spatial zoning according to best fit passive design practices. There's 3 sub-questions there. Those sub-questions relate back to the design decision chart that we were just looking at. Then we have this new section on bundles, and bundles tries to answer an interesting question because in the 2nd edition, what we found out was that we had this big toolbox, right? There's lots of strategies, and if you weren't kind of experienced, it was difficult to know which combinations of strategies to use, which ones made sense to go together, which ones didn't. So these bundles try to ask the question, what's the recurrent question that architects or urban designers have that deals with energy and climate, location, and so forth, and then put together strategies that will work most of the time in most buildings or most neighborhoods that you're designing to deal with that issue. So you can see there's really three scales. There's 4 bundles at the level 9 neighborhoods. There's 4 bundles at the level 6 whole buildings, and then 1 bundle down at level 4 rooms. These are just sample bundles. Um, there's no limit on how many bundles or ways that you could package up different strategies to go together. These are just ones that we started out with. So for example, here's a neighborhood bundle, neighborhood of light. And this is really asking the question, what would the city be like? What would a neighborhood be like if you needed to get light access to daylight to every building? So each bundle has some key points. It gives a context. It describes the forces that are involved. It makes a recommendation, and it gives an example. It also gives you a bundle diagram. The bundle diagram in this case is trying to build the neighborhood of light, which is the level 9 bundle scale at neighborhoods. That's composed of 3 subscales: urban fabric, urban elements, and whole building. The wrapper around the outside, that heavy dashed line, we call the bundle wrapper. Everything inside that we consider something that you might want to look at. There's 2 designations inside that bundle wrapper. One is for core strategies. Those have a heavy black line around them. And the other is situational strategies. The difference is that core strategies apply to both of the variations of the bundle, and situational strategies apply more to that particular variation. So for instance, daylight envelopes applies to all locations. Shadow umbrella, overhead shades, shared shade, those things apply more to a hot climate bundle. For instance, here is the cold climate bundle, and you'll see some variations there. Now we include things like glazed streets and solar envelopes. Here's an example of a bundle that has another type. It has some strategies on the outside of the bundle wrapper, and we call those refiners. And that just means you can think about them. You might want to use them. You might not want to use them. They might help to refine the project and the performance that you're working on. So this is one way to think about how to navigate around too, is that if you realize that you're working on a topic, you go and take a look at the bundle. Maybe you're already considering one of the strategies, then you start to look at what strategies are related to that that might work together in some kind of synergy to solve that kind of a problem. All right, then we also have some appendices, and here this gives you a distinction about which kinds of things, which kinds of appendices are located in the printed volume, which kinds are located in the electronic volume. So in the printed volume, you'll find the printed contents and electric contents in detail form, abbreviations and unit conversions, a glossary for all the weird terms we use, and a bibliography for those sources that are located in the printed volume, those citations that we will use in the printed volume. Over in the electronic volume, you'll find the climate data. That's organized by latitude and city. You'll also find additional climate data and a bibliography that deals with the citations that are used in the electronic volume. So here's what those detailed contents look like. And you can see that instead of just listing, for instance, something like thermal sailing, the whole statement about thermal sailing is listed there. Same thing for the electronic contents. The detailed version takes things like the design strategies. And again, instead of just having the title or the name or the handle of that strategy, it lists the whole strategy statement. Also tells you in the brackets what the energy issues that it's dealing with: heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation, etc. And you can see these are organized in the same way. They're organized by levels of complexity, organized by the elements like rooms and courtyards. And then they're also organized by what you do with those elements. So for instance, at the level of room organizations, there's different types of organizations. Strategies 24 down to 29 there are dealing with zoned organizations. Let's take a look at the indices. We try to make it so that you can find what you want from a lot of different ways, and instead of having one massive index, we broke the index up into 3 different parts. So there's a subject index. If I just want to know, for instance, something about daylighting, I can look up daylighting in the subject index. If I want to look up, let's say, all the buildings by Louis Kahn, I could use the designers and precedents index. If I remember the name of a building but not the name of the architect, oh, that was the Jacobs 2 house. Who was that architect? You look up Jacobs 2, you find out, yeah, that was Frank Lloyd Wright, and it'll tell you where to find that precedent. Then there's also the Design Tools Index. That includes all the tables, all the graphs, all the design guidelines. So for example, let's say I want to size a window for daylighting. I remember there's a daylighting aperture sizing tool. I go look that up in the Design Tools Index, right? I don't have to know what strategy it's located in. So subject index, pretty straightforward. Just remember that the E page numbers are in the electronic volume. The pages with no E are in the printed volume. So pretty long and extensive subject index. Designers and precedent index. So for instance, you can see these are alphabetical. I can look up Adler and Sullivan. I can look up Acoma Pueblo. I can look up things by buildings. I can look them up by architect, designer, etc. And then finally, the design tools index, tables, graphs, etc. I want to find the balance point. I want to find something about ideal sizes for atrium blocks. So for instance, I want to know about R values. I've got R values for airflow windows, R values for berm walls, R values for glazing and insulation, etc. All right, let's take a look at the SWL electronic volume. And the nice thing about this one is it has built in some bookmarks. So over here we see some bookmarks on the left. We're now on the cover page. We can just navigate this way, find the title page. Let's go down to contents. So you can have the abbreviated contents in here, just like you saw in the printed volume. This only here is referencing what's in the electronic volume. Using these bookmarks, you can see that this is organized by scale and complexity, just like the contents are. And any one of these can be opened up. If I want to see all the strategies at level 8, I can open that up. If I click on one of these, it'll go straight to that strategy. So it's a pretty easy way to navigate. So you'll find larger scale strategies up at the top, smaller scale strategies, for instance, level 2 elements, thermal mass, earth edges, right, down lower in the sequence. So oftentimes one way to navigate is think about what you're designing. What are you trying to solve for? If I'm thinking about thermal mass, that's going to be an element. I'm going to size the thermal mass. If I'm thinking about how the thermal mass is organized, I'm going to go up to a larger scale and look at something like, well, let's see what's up. Mass arrangement, for instance. Right? So that's going to be a question about where that mass goes and how it's built into the various systems of walls, floors, or roofs, etc. So moving down in the scale, I'll close these up. We can go down here to the detailed analysis techniques. And if we go to climate as context, for instance, it'll tell us a little bit about that section. And then I have all my analysis techniques. Right, so climate as context tells us about the nature of climate, right? Trying to understand that as a place and what it offers us and what its limitations are, how it's our friend and our enemy. Program and use, that deals with programming, that deals with things like scheduling of loads, but also what happens inside the building, heat gains from people, lighting, equipment, electric loads, etc. Water loads. Form and envelope is how heat flows through the skin, solar gain through windows, ventilation and infiltration, which can be gain or loss. And then a section that combines those with things like the bioclimatic chart, earth contact, shading calendar helps you determine when you need to shade, and then techniques to add up total heat gains and loss, to look at the whole building as balance point, and that keys you into certain strategies that you might want to look at for what works in your particular combination of the balance point, which is a function of your building, your climate, and your use. Then we have the appendices, right? And in the appendices, we've got detailed contents, we've got abbreviations, etc. And this is all from the printed volume, but now we're down the electronic. So we have climate and information there, climate by latitude and city. And we just thought this was an interesting way to organize it. So everything occurs either by city or by latitude. And there's only 5 example climates where we're giving you climate data. So you see, for instance, New Orleans at 30 degrees, Phoenix occurs at 33, St. Louis at 39, Eugene, and Minneapolis. So a range of different climates, hot, cold, dry, humid, marine, etc. And then you'll see that the climate maps are repeated again. And then we start with the latitude. So you can get sun charts for every latitude or every 4 degrees of latitude. Then we have various, extra things. These are mainly things that you would use if you were working a particular kind of a technique. So if you want to study something about daylighting, you might look at daylight availability or sky cover, etc. And that's it. Down to the bibliography, and you know how to use one of those. One more thing we might point out, up at each one of these scales, there's an intro that talks about the scale and the strategies at that scale. And then when you get to a particular level, it'll give you the names, numbers, and so forth, and statements of the strategies at that level. So for instance, level 5 room organizations, you can get an overview of what's happening at that scale. That's another way to find what you're looking for. And then finally, of course, at least in this version, you can search in Acrobat. You can just search by keywords. But sometimes if you just search for something generic like heating or lighting or cooling, it'll take you a long time to find what you're looking for. So the more specific you can be, the better. All right, so that's an overview of how to move around inside of Sun, Wind, and Light.